Hello and welcome back to the Premier Injuries channel. Today, we are doing one of our brilliant analyses with Raj from Free CB Performance. We like to do a weekly podcast talking about injuries, but today's one is less about a quantifiable injury, more about the unquantifiable psychology around the sport. Raj, I want to talk to you today about Thomas Tuchel versus Antonio Conte. Tuchel has said that the World Cup is already distracting his players, whereas Conte says that he's not really that worried about it. He thinks that if players want to win, they will, and they don't consider too much about these injuries. I mean, is there a right answer on this? Is Tuchel right? Is Conte right? Or is it kind of an in-between?
I mean, it's hard to say who's right, who's wrong, right? I think a lot of it's in the eye of the beholder. Each also has very different communication styles. I think Tuchel tend to be a little bit more on the emotional intelligence side, whereas Conte tends to give more of his own opinion. Like we saw last season when Tottenham was losing, and he's like, I don't know if we're going to stay, stuff like that. So to me, Conte tends to give a little bit more of his own. Tuchel tends to give more of a more insight into the player's view. For example, when Ziyech was hurt last season, Tuchel went into depth about how he was having, confidence issues and feeling different when he moved with his shoulder. And so he gave a lot of insight into those aspects. So they're very different communicators. So I think you have to take both through a different lens.
It's quite interesting. I mean, let's start off with Tuchel's points then.
Yeah.
He said that he believes the Winter World Cup is already having a negative impact on his preparations for the season, but also he anticipates players returning mentally and physically drained when the season is over. So my question to you, Raj, is how is this different from African Cup of Nations? And also, how does this differ from players maybe at the end of a season when the World Cup normally is? Surely this would be a similar problem then.
Yeah, I think the big issue is that it's in the middle of the season. So in that case, it is quite similar, right, to AFCON in that regard. The difference here is it's likely more players who are going, and you could say the World Cup, due to the level of teams, is a higher level of intensity and competition. I mean, it's the biggest tournament, right, in the world, and so that naturally lends itself to a higher intensity and more mental focus on it as well. And then now you put it in the middle of the season. That's never happened before. And so, of course, it lends itself to a lot of new variables coming into play.
So maybe in the other flip side of it, Antonio Conte has said, I was a player. When you play a game, you want to win. You don't think about being injured or risk to injury. Do you think that in one sense, though, Conte could be incorrect here from maybe players, especially those in his squad, the likes of Kane or others who have a history of injuries, who may not have a strong level of kinesiophobia, but they might have it in the back of their mind that, yes, I'm injury prone. I might take my foot off just the gas until we see the World Cup because I don't want to miss the biggest tournament of my life.
Yeah, I would think that plays more so. I think I can't rule that out. Of course, you can't subconsciously, that might be at play. I think it'll come more into play if a player got injured and they're looking at coming back prior to the World Cup. Whereas they might just think about, let me be a little bit more methodical and more conservative here with my recovery so I don't get re-injured. Whereas before, they might have been more tolerant to more risk to come back and win those points right early on in the season. So that to me would be more of the concern rather than on the front end.
Could it also be, you've talked about Tuchel and Conte having differing approaches towards player psychology. Could it be as well that Tuchel's approach is kind of maybe tackle the situation and make it an outlier problem, so kind of create it as a problem from the outside coming in, whereas Conte is tackling it as a positive and something that the players can control by putting it out of their mind? Is that maybe an insight into their two differing approaches as well, that Conte kind of wants to always be in control and always make it as positive as possible?
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think that's absolutely a great point. It goes back to the communication style. You say, I think Conte tends to be a lot more about controlling what you can control, whereas Tuchel, even Klopp, I think they're right. They always complain about um, fissure congestion and how nothing changes. Jurgen Klopp has mentioned that numerous times, and I think this plays into that as well. But I think the psychology of that part is a really good point. And so that's something that Conte might be using, just trying to focus his players in that regard. And I also think Conte knows that for him, it might be more of an. I think Tuchel knows. I think Chelsea is a clear number 3 in the league, whereas Conte might be challenging more so to remain in the Champions League potentially, right? So it might be something where Tuchel is coming from that point of view where he's a little more comfortable already, whereas Conte is just trying to get the most out of his team. And so again, it's an interesting point. It's just very, really interesting. Obviously, there's two sides to that equation, and so there's no right or wrong answer here. What we do know is that it's a massive. I think Tuchel's right in that it's going to be a massive drain on the players. That's just what it is. I mean, you put a tournament in the middle of the season that's the biggest in the world, and you have limited breaks around it. It's going to be a big drain. But to Conte's point, you can't really control that. That's not much you can do about that. But I think Conte's being optimistic, whereas Tuchel's being a little bit more realistic.
I think another point as well is Conte kind of opens this out a little bit more. He says the problems are for all teams, the same problems for Man City, Liverpool, Chelsea, Manchester United, Arsenal, West Ham, and even the promoted teams to the Premier League. I mean, is there an element of truth to that as well?
Yeah.
It's kind of, you have to get on with it because everybody is in the same boat.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I really liked the interview overall from Conte in that he was pretty much saying, like, this applies to every team. Of course, some teams might have more players, but regardless, you have to prepare those. If you have even one player going to the World Cup, right, you have to have those protocols in place for when you're going to prepare them for the World Cup, when they come back, how you're going to rest them, right, and how you're going to prepare them for the ramp up back into that season. And so it certainly applies to all teams.
And I wanted to ask as well, in terms of, first of all, on the physical side of things, what do you anticipate teams are going to do with handling players who do go to the World Cup and who don't? Because the problem with the players that don't go to the World Cup is obviously deconditioning. So would you say that teams are going to be worse off with lots of players going or less players going, and then maybe not having any competitive matches to kind of almost have a mini preseason to bring them back into the fold again?
Yeah, I think you nailed it with the preseason aspect. I think you'll see that players who don't go, they're going to be involved kind of almost in another. I mean, you have almost a month off, so you're going to be involved in almost like it's a month before the season again. So it's that preseason aspect, and of course your fitness levels are going to be higher because you're already a couple months, more than a couple months into the season already, and so that'll be a higher level preseason to keep them fit in that regard, and so. But I think you're going to see when games do start back up, those players are probably going to be a little sloppier because they haven't played competitively for a while, right? Whereas those players who do go to the World Cup, they'll be given some X amount of rest period likely afterwards and then ramped up again. And so I think with those players, the real concern becomes as you get deeper into the season and you see the cumulative effect from the World Cup, I think that's going to be the real issue when you get into March or maybe, early, not late February into March is where you might see some of that World Cup intensity really creep up if the player wasn't already injured at the World Cup.
I think as well, in terms of an individual player, is this going to benefit the likes of Mo Salah? Because we have seen in the last couple of seasons, second half of the season, he usually tails off a little bit. He has a downward kind of outward in performances. Could this actually benefit him that he could keep a high level all through the season because he's not going to the World Cup? We know that Liverpool work with Zone 7, so there's a AI kind of controlling his workload and things like that. could we see maybe the best season from Mo Salah yet?
I think it's certainly possible. And the fact that not only does it allow him to be more well rested, but now he's potentially playing second half of the season against more fatigued players, right? And so, which is a scary thought. And so, I think, yeah, absolutely, that could be a key thing for him as well. And I think that goes for a lot of players who potentially tend to have some of those fitness issues on the back half of the season. For example, like with Arsenal, Emile Smith-Rowe might benefit if he's not called up and plays, right? So because he, like last season, second half, he had significant fitness issues, and even they're bringing him along very slowly right now as well. So it might benefit players like him who tend to fall off in the second half of the season.
Bring it back to player psychology then, because this is something that you really do know about as one of your expertises. And is there a problem with the interruption of the sports psychology process? You know, you set goals, you work through the season, and then you reset before an international tournament. Is there going to be a big disruption, or do you think that clubs have, brought that into their thoughts and feelings? And obviously the international level as well, they have done that. What do you think? Is this a disruption to routines and the competition preparation process?
It's definitely a disruption on all levels, right? Whether you're a coaching staff, whether you're physical staff, whether you're a medical staff, whether you're on the sports psychology staff, it's certainly a disruption, but something you have to plan for. And I think it's a new variable, and you try to put these protocols in place to help with it. And some of it is new ground, right? Because this has never happened before, and might not ever happen again with the Winter World Cup. And so it's certainly something that's a disruptor, but it's all about how do you mitigate those disruptions through proper planning. So
I was going to say, let's hope there isn't another Winter World Cup.
Yeah.
Do you think as well that players have already developed new interruption-based techniques because of COVID? Do you think that in many ways COVID was almost a positive, a silver lining to the situation, that they've worked with an interrupted schedule to a season, that they've already had a trial run of this situation?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, I think that was an extreme because you couldn't even come in to the training facilities. And so, but I think in general, I think you make a great point there, where just in terms of not having those games or not being completely in the same schedule or routine, although I think teams, for players who don't go to the World Cup, will try to keep players in as much of the same routine as possible. You'll probably even see them playing in those closed door friendlies as well, trying to, kind of how you do prior to a season. So I think they'll do their best. But I think to your point, COVID may have prepared people. It's almost like, working from home for people in the office, right? Where it's like you're just used to it now. And so you understand kind of the mentality that it takes. The good news here is that it won't be that extreme because you don't have all those regulations in place.
Well, I think that's a really useful point to end on, a fascinating insight into the psychology of this upcoming World Cup. We will be keeping you up to date with all sorts of injury information. And just for people, do check out Raj over at Free CB Performance. You always do amazing stuff. We will be back next week. I'm not sure what we'll be talking about. We might be talking about a topical kind of thing like this, or we might be talking about an individual injury. But make sure to stay subscribed to the channel because it's always great fun to chat to you, Raj.
Cheers, man. Thanks for having me on.